All right. Good evening, everyone. So I know that now I am truly the one standing between you and cocktails, and it's going to be great cocktails later. But I wanted to thank Mandy. I don't know whether she's still here. She will join us later, I hope, for calling out the opening video. Sometimes, we cannot just think that it's a nice scene setter. We don't really pay attention to it. But the one thing that is really important that it is true, that there is a very young lady who was responsible for that video. Huh, Deanna? You want to... Let's give her a round of applause. Okay. Now, unlike what Yvonne said, I probably can't do any justice to all the speakers and the depth of the content that was actually shared over the 4 panels, other than to say that it is actually always about perspectives when we think about going beyond binaries. So the first thing that I want to do is to pose a question to the audience. Not a very deep technical question. But if you look at this golf ball, right? Look at this golf ball. Can I just ask you to let me know, how many dimples do you think are generally on a golf ball? Less than 100? Anyone? 125? Well, that's very precise. So somewhere between 100 to 200? Or how many believe it's between 100 to 200? Okay, very good. A few. 200 to 300? A few more? 300 to 400? Just a handful. 400 to 500? Oh, almost nobody. And beyond 500? Really? Okay. The answer is that actually, like what you heard just now from John, it depends. But most golf balls generally have about 300 plus dimples. Can you believe that? Okay, 300 plus. And it is true that I think there is a Japanese brand of a golf ball that actually has more than 500 dimples. I don't know how it affects the aerodynamics and whether it helps your game better, but why do I ask this question? I ask this question because you can all see what this golf ball is about. It is small, it is in the palm of my hands. Most of us would probably have come up quite close to a golf ball, and yet you look at the differences in opinions we have about just a simple question like how many dimples you think can fit on this golf ball. Okay? So what am I getting at? So how do we actually perceive threats? It is also very simple. We can stare at the same set of facts, look at the same situation, but come to very different conclusions. Now, in the near term, probably today, we will be saying that, hey, there are a lot of security and macroeconomic challenges that we are facing. This is the near-term threat. If we are asked, what do you think are some of the more important medium-term threats? We probably talk about the change in the global order. Right? Today, we no longer have that kind of universal consensus support for global cooperation, a very internationalist way of looking at solving transnational challenges like pandemics and climate change. In the longer term, though, there is that existential threat that we face from the climate crisis. Now, if you look at the font sizes, and I always drill my team on font sizes, you'll notice that the further away it is, the less you think it's a real threat, right? So I think a couple of GenZero Climate Summits ago, I mentioned how it was possible that within a few months of the COVID crisis, we were able to mobilize hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars to support the global economy. But today, on something as important as climate change, we would struggle to be able to catalyze a few $billion for anything. Why? And that is because the urgent displaces the important. Something that is long-term would actually be perhaps a little bit more important, but because it's far away, just like the rear view mirror, something, it is actually far closer than you think, but you perceive it to be far away and therefore less urgent, less important. Now, we have been talking about headwinds. If we go to many climate conferences today, we will probably be discussing about the many macro challenges that we face and all the headwinds that we face. But is it necessarily true that when you face headwinds, you cannot make progress? So those of us I was sharing who are involved in the process of sailing will realize that there is actually a way even for sailboats to make progress against headwinds by a process called tacking. You cannot go head on, but you can certainly move if you go 45 left, 45 degrees right, and you will zigzag your way to the final destination. It will be a little bit longer, it is not as straightforward, but progress can still be made. So headwinds should not necessarily deter us. But How does one then fly against the wind and be able to do this? Now, birds often have to fly against the wind. They cannot kind of like just say, oh, look, sorry, I'll just wait for another day when the winds are in my favor, right? So one of the things that we learn is they have aerodynamics. They are efficient in the way that they move. So for us, even in the climate space or in the carbon markets, how do we remove all the unnecessary overheads and costs? How do we become more efficient in the things that we do? For example, does this require us to be more standardized, to harmonize our requirements, right? And to avoid this fragmentation that results in unnecessary costs. They use headwinds as lift. Because if you think about it, right, like the eagles when they want to soar, if there are no headwinds, you actually can't lift off quite as easily. Think about fighter pilots who have to land their planes on aircraft carriers. The carrier actually turns itself against the wind in order to make sure that they reduce the airspeed the ground speed, so that the fighter aircraft can actually land more easily. But the point here really is this: the headwinds actually sometimes can give us some additional motivations, whether it is about honing the things that we need to do, make us think about what we are actually doing, and make us a little bit better. And finally, birds sometimes avoid some of these headwinds by flying low. Actually, many of us in the climate space are doing a little bit of this. You want to fly a little bit below the radar, do your work quietly. There is no need to make a big song and dance about all the things that we are doing, but we are making slow and steady progress. Now, for us in the climate space, I would also hazard that as we are trying to make headway against the currents, right, there are a few things that we should think about. First, 3 R's. The first, reframe. Reframe the way that we are thinking about the work that we are doing. Rebalance our portfolios and our activities. And finally, reinforce the areas that we think will make sense. Let me explain it a little bit more. So, what we used to call energy transition is being reframed in a narrative as energy security. At GenZero, we are big supporters of solutions like sustainable aviation fuel, and I have some of our portfolio companies and colleagues here in the room. If you think about what is happening in the Middle East today, is that a net negative or net positive for those of us who are involved with sustainable aviation fuel? Now, on the one hand, you might say, hey, look, it's causing all of these disruptions, airlines are suffering, this is a bad problem. But on the other hand, if you think about it, a move into biofuels allow us to actually diversify away from fossil feedstock that comes from only a few places in the world. It actually democratizes access to energy. Renewables do the same. Everyone will have a little bit of sunshine and hopefully some wind. But the point of it really is that we have got to reframe the way that we are thinking. All the sessions today are encouraging us to reframe. The first session was talking about this nature versus tech, reduction versus removal divide, and the conclusion that comes out of that is really that you kind of like need both. They are really not opposites to each other. The second panel talking about the investment climate tells us that it's really not about whether you want to put money into the US or in China. You really kind of like have opportunities in all jurisdictions and across different solution sets. The third panel is actually sharing about the importance of carbon pricing, but it is also debunking the false choice between setting ambitious carbon pricing and economic growth. Because ultimately, when your companies transform, they become more resilient for the future, ultimately that creates value. And the final panel is debunking the idea that it is a choice between mitigation and adaptation. You kind of like need both, and what some of the panelists are sharing is that the solutions can actually achieve both objectives at the same time. We need to reframe. We also need to rebalance. Now, clearly, we are headed into a much more climate-impaired world, right? So if we are headed into a more climate-impaired world where we cannot keep under 1.5 degrees, clearly, the solutions that will help us adapt will become more important. It is also almost certainly going to be fact that there's going to be much more carbon in the atmosphere and in our environment come 2050. And that means that to restore planetary health, it is almost necessary to remove more of the carbon out of our environment. And therefore, to some extent, while we are still rightly focused on mitigation, so you don't want to fill up the bathtub too much, just as you're removing the water from the tub, there will need to be a bit of a rebalancing in terms of where we dedicate our efforts and where we put our capital. And finally, we need to reinforce. We need to reinforce the basics around focus on value and not just values. Now, many of the climate solutions today, as you saw in the video, already exist that will help us to achieve net zero. More importantly, increasing numbers of climate solutions today are in the money. They are cost effective. You know? Over 80% of the new builds for power in the world are actually in renewables and clean energy. Why? It's not just suddenly because everybody woke up and decided to support the climate agenda, but because it makes commercial sense. Today, the top-selling car in Singapore is an electric vehicle. Why? Not just because Singaporean drivers suddenly wake up and decide that they want to drive cleaner cars, but because it is cost-effective. So really, we need to have an understanding that we need to reinforce solutions that can deliver value and not just about values. Now, clearly, things are not going that great. And I think while we want to recognize some of the challenges that we face, it is also important for many of us who are in the climate space to continue to have confidence in what we do. So I ask all of us to remember the first time that we took a plunge in the pool. Were we scared? Were we afraid that we would drown? When we now bring our children, right, and introduce them to swimming, do they cry? And we put all kinds of things to help them to be comfortable, right? We have toys, we have floats, we have everything. We carry them down with us in order to be able to help them. But you know, Megan from Decarb Partners is not here. But when she shared with me her experience of having her kids learn how to swim, her neighbor told her, don't bother with all the floaties, just throw them in and they will be fine. I won't exactly recommend that, but there is some wisdom to it. That if you don't take the trainers off, right, you will never really learn how to do it. But the important thing is that once you learn how to swim, depth is irrelevant. So once we get some of our things right about the carbon markets, once we get some of the things right about climate solutions, we should not continue to fear all the headwinds and the pressures and all that. Something that is cost-effective, something that is in the money, something that gives value, cheaper, better. Would you be worried about whether there will be political change or that some other administration is going to come in and tell you, oh, this doesn't feel right? Nobody so far has voted against their own wallets, right? So the question is that once you get certain things right, other external conditions don't matter. Once you learn how to swim, you can go out into the ocean and you'll still be swimming. So ultimately, perspectives matter. This is a more recent picture of the world taken from the Artemis mission. I think at our first GenZero Climate Summit, I also showed a picture like that, but of course from the Apollo mission, because we have not gone out there for quite a while. Now, one of the differences, as I mentioned then, between this view of Earth and the more conventional view that we know it when we are taking a plane or we are looking at the atlas on a map, is that our maps and the atlas and everything show borders. They tell you exactly where one country ends and another country begins. But when you look at the planet, right, from Earth, which is the real view of the planet, there are no borders. Now, so what does it tell us? It tells us a couple of things. One, the mission that we are actually on actually transcends narrow boundaries, right? It's not about them versus us. It's not about this versus that. We are in this together, right? Secondly, and it's an important thing, you know, there was a period of time long ago that the land mass in Asia was connected almost all the way to Australia, right? We can actually walk from place to place. And indeed, we still see some of these migrations take place. The birds are one, but even in Africa and elsewhere, you see animals actually migrate for seasons when water is exhausted or rains are not coming and so on and so forth, they move. Now today, after the Age of Enlightenment, right, where we have the rise of nation states and the advent of the passport, how easy is it for us to actually move from place to place, looking for a better climate, looking for water, looking for food? It becomes impossible. It becomes impossible. So in the future, in a much more climate impact world, if you have money, you're a climate tourist. But if you don't have money, you will become a climate refugee. This is actually the perspective ultimately that matters when we think about what we are doing with climate solutions and climate investing. It is ultimately about people. right? And what we do. So while perspectives matter, that we want to go beyond binaries, we need to maintain a sense of perspective, right? That this is actually what is ultimately the prize that we are playing for, the objectives that we are actually going for, the mission that we are all involved in. So I think I close by really encouraging all of us to maintain this sense of perspective, this sense of mission, that while times are difficult, we are going through a rough patch as an industry and as a sector, that the ultimate prize that we are playing for is worth it. Just like the salmon that will go upstream. I have some of my colleagues tell me, showing the picture, is it a little bit inauspicious because the salmon will go upstream and then after they spawn, they die. You can make a lot of sacrifices. It can be a tough journey, but the question is always whether the end is worth it. And I think that for us, on the climate issue, the end is worth it. So with that, thank you very much, everyone, and I hope that you continue to have a great week ahead. Thank you.